Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar on declining productivity. Our goal in running these quarterly webinars and the associated explorations report is to really explore a long-term trend or topic that we believe will affect our investments. So it really informs us as we go and put together portfolios and make investment decisions, and we believe it informs our constituents, you, the client, in really preparing for the future. We are long-term investors. We're investing for retirement. Sometimes we're investing for the next generation. And today's topic is particularly interesting, declining productivity. We're going to tackle it from two levels. The first part is from an economic standpoint. So what does productivity mean for the US globally? And then we're going to tackle it from an individual and company level. What does it mean personally? How do we get better at productivity, increase productivity? And for that second part, we're featuring a guest speaker, Dr. Jessica Weiss. Very happy to have her on as a guest speaker today. She is a PhD in clinical psychology. She's a co-founder and director of Grand Central Psychology, which is a private practice in New York City and Westchester. She specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and mood disorders. And she also leads corporate and nonprofit workshops on topics related to behavioral health and productivity. She's passionate about women leadership, and she currently leads Rising Woman, a professional women's group. So excited to have her on. And the second part of this webinar will be conversational in nature. And to that point, you can add questions. I think there's a Q&A box on Zoom. And so we are going to try to make it conversational. At any point someone has a question, please put it into that box, and we will attempt to get to it at some point during this webinar or perhaps towards the end. So with that, let's get right into the importance of productivity. I'm going to read this quote from Yuval Harari, who I think really provides a very clear view on history and clear view on where we're going. For the first time in history, infectious diseases kills fewer people than old age, famine kills fewer people than obesity, and violence kills fewer people than accidents. In our day-to-day life, it's so easy to kind of lose track of the progress we've made in humanity. It's really easy to look at all the issues we've had. But if you look at this chart, which is world average GDP per capita, and GDP stands for gross domestic product, right? You can see, and this is constant dollars, which means it doesn't take into account inflation, anything else. You can see that we've grown in terms of wealth. And what that really means, right, because having additional dollars, what does that mean? It's true wealth. And what that means is that we've grown in quality of life. And that's what we all care about. You know, the idea that you could, to go really, really far back, you don't have to create fire, right? You could be up at night when it's really dark outside, because now you could just flip a switch and you have light, right? That's something we all take for granted, but 300 years ago, it was not taken for granted. 1,000 years ago, it wasn't even a thing, right? And so you can see in the Industrial Revolution around the 1800s, we really started sloping up, and it feels like we're innovating quicker and quicker as the years go by. And some of it's good, some of it may not be good. We'll see, we'll discuss that with Jessica. But ultimately what it comes down to is wealth equates generally, right, as long as it's across the board, the world, right? Maybe some people get more of it than others, but ultimately it pulls us all up. So increasing wealth generally equals increasing quality of life, right? And then when you start, I guess when you look at the equation of how you come up with that GDP, gross domestic product, right? And gross domestic product, just to step back for a moment, when you look at US gross domestic product, it's the output of workers in the US from both a labor standpoint and from a service standpoint. So it's it's products produced, services offered, that equals GDP in a one-year cycle. And the inputs for GDP growth is labor growth plus productivity growth. So right off the bat, you could see, and we've put it out in our explorations report, and we've put it out in reaching out to everybody on the call today. Productivity is extremely important. And here you could see it's one of two inputs to create better quality of life and to create more increased wealth. And we've spoken about it in past explorations. From a demographic standpoint, labor growth is going to be pressured. And what we put here on the screen is US unemployment rate. So this graphic on the top shows the unemployment rate. And then the graphic on the top, which we prefer to use at Fountainhead, is labor force participation rate. You could see that the participation rate really increased through the 70s and 80s. And a big component of that is women increasingly joining the workforce. And then you see around, I think it was 96, 98, somewhere around there, it got to the highest level, which might have been 67, 68%. And it's really declined since then. And then obviously we had COVID, and that created more of a decline. But the bigger point here is demographics and prime age decline. And it's probably helpful just to understand what labor force, like all the numbers that go into it. So the labor force is defined as everybody older than 16. So 16 and older who are not incarcerated, who are not in the military, and who are not in nursing homes. So if you take that whole group, it's about 260 million out of 325 million Americans. And then unemployment is included in the participation rate. So right now, with the participation rate of 61.5 and unemployment of 6%, you actually have 55% of 260 million people, which comes out to roughly 140 million people working out of 325 million people. And that means 140 million are supporting one way or another 325 million. And demographics, and we see this more in Japan, and we're going to see it in China, and we've spoken about this, right? As the population ages, right, you have more issues. And so on one side, you have that problem of, okay, how many people are supporting a nation? And then on the other side, which perhaps we'll get to, is what's the future of jobs? What's going on, right? Excellent. And here, actually, before we get into this, I wanted to really explain what productivity really is. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a couple of examples. And the first example I'm going to use is Jessica's practice, if you don't mind. Jessica, you good for that?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, great. Let's go.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Definitely. It's an honor and a pleasure. So you are a PhD, correct?
Yeah, that is right.
Good job. When did you become, when did you get accredited? How long ago was that? Roughly.
You're gonna age me. 16 years ago. I think it was May 2005, yeah.
It's a great way to start, right? It's like, give me a, so before your PhD, to post your PhD, were you able to increase the amount you charged per client?
Of course. When I was an intern, for example, if I had actually charged people, it would have been extremely less than once I got my PhD.
Right. So that's one element of productivity, right? So Jessica went through school, and she was an intern at some point, and she went back to school, and she upgraded her experiences and her education, and she eventually was able to charge what she charges today. So that's an example of productivity, and that actually falls under labor composition. And as a country, if we increase education and we provide people, or if people, from a personal standpoint, increase their education, they're able to attain more in the economy, and that's very different than inflation. Right. So right now, if next year Jessica decides, guess what, everybody, I'm raising my prices by 5% because I can, Well, right, because it's a supply-demand equation. So Jessica's only going to raise it if she thinks she could attain, make at least as much money. That is not productivity. That is inflation. Next question for you. What does your office, like, how are you setting up appointments? How are you billing people? Do you have a staff there? Do you have a person, what's going on there?
Yeah, we actually do not have a staff. We don't have an admin staff. It's me, my partner. We have several psychologists that work for us, and we actually use a software that helps us to do that. So it's one software that helps both with billing and appointment scheduling.
Okay. And then when you were all the way back in the beginning of your career, when you were an intern, did that office, I assume you worked as an intern with some office if you were in the same space, did that office have an administrative staff? Did they have secretaries? Did they?
Yeah. So if we look at actually when I was a postdoc, so I was an early career psychologist, there was a staff, yes, absolutely, who helped with both billing and scheduling. And that was because it was a big group practice that I was one part of.
Okay, so that right there, there's two elements there, right? One part is you invested, right? You invested in software, which is more of it's called capital deepening is the term, but right, and that's a part of productivity. And then, well, I'm going to use another example in a minute, but when you invested, there was probably some amount of time that you needed to spend on the software to understand the software and the whole bit. But what ended up happening there is now, let's just imagine for a second, Jessica actually had one person working in her office, and then she was able to get rid of that person, right? All of a sudden, if you kind of think of COGS, because people are anybody who's taken like at least that initial economics class remembers COGS, it's just a unit of something, right? Sure. All of a sudden, the unit of something created, there was one less person involved. And so now when you look at the equation, the way they figured this out when they do the math on like measuring productivity, that's an increase in productivity because the output is higher, you have one less person, right? And so if you think about it, we've increased productivity in the office by buying software and replacing these administrators. So that's another example. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to use another example. We just recently acquired software for Fountainhead. And the reason we did that was, we have well over 2,000 accounts, and there's a lot to kind of keep track of, and we just needed to upgrade. And there's no question, initially, there's been a decline of productivity because we need to learn it. We need to learn, okay, we have to build it out a little bit. We need to learn, okay, what do we do? How does this software work? And then the next level after that is once we're kind of good on it, maybe we catch up productivity level. So we still haven't increased our productivity, but the next part, and it's the most, I'm actually going to bring back up the presentation here. It's the part where we have the most upside from a humanity standpoint is that total, it's called total factor productivity. And that's us looking at this software, starting to use the software and saying, oh, wow, what if we do it this way? Or what if we do it that way? And the best example of that would be Henry Ford, right? So everybody knows, right, Ford, or everybody gives Ford credit. We don't all know, but we all give Ford credit for the assembly line, right? And if you think about the assembly line, maybe Ford spent a lot on machinery, but ultimately the assembly line wasn't capital deepening, right? He didn't spend on the assembly line. The assembly line wasn't labor composition. It wasn't like all of a sudden everybody Henry Ford, had better education and better skill sets. It really came down to what's called total factor productivity. He innovated, right? And that's ultimately what everybody wants to look at. And that's ultimately where we really have the potential for growth. And from a country standpoint, right? And we always think, okay, America, you always think, okay, we're the most innovative out there, even though there's some numbers that are showing maybe we're not quite there anymore. We definitely still have by far the best college system, which helps from a demographic standpoint, because we definitely need immigrants. It just comes down to, who we may want to come in, and we're not going to get into politics here, but either way, you need people to help. But ultimately, the way to really get ahead is that total factor productivity. And I really believe that's on a global level, on a country level, and then on a business specific level. And we'll get back to having a conversation with Jessica about that, because I think there's a lot of elements that she focuses on and specializes on that could really help us all on the individual level and then on the company level. So really quickly on this chart, as you can see, the productivity over the last 14 years, this is 2004 through 2008, 2004 through 2018, has been underwhelming. And because of the pressure on labor growth, there may even be labor decline, as we've seen. This is really important for economists. And if you take it full circle, we have rates near 0%. We had a quote in the Explorations report that came from the Fed, where it's basically like, yeah, we don't feel like we could raise rates because productivity isn't where it's supposed to be. So again, I can't stop kind of pointing to how important productivity growth is. As mentioned, labor composition is that element where we use Jessica as an example, where she got a PhD, and so that's adjustments in labor. Capital deepening is that example where Jessica invested in software, right? And so investments help productivity. And then total factor productivity was learning how to use it all. We actually have a question that I'm going to take now. It was, how long can our labor force participation I misread it. How low can our labor force participation actually go? How many people are actually working currently? So we touched a little on the current. If you go back a slide right here, so what's interesting is Japan actually got up to 75% labor participation rate at some point in time. I always use them as a canary in the, get the full expression, but because they have the most increased demographics in terms of they're really aging. And then when we had the debt discussion, they're by far have the highest debt load of any country globally, at least from a developed market standpoint. They're currently at 61%. I think from a demographic standpoint, again, mentioned, I think we won't have as much issues as a lot of the rest of the developed world, because I believe we'll still be able to attract people to our shores when we want it. And then from the job standpoint, it's actually a really nice introduction to the last slide that we'll talk about today. If you look back to the 1800s, close to 95% of jobs in this country were in agriculture. If you look at it today, that's 3%. I imagine 150, 200 years ago, people had this same conversation of, oh my God, we can now get a combine and we don't need so many people on the farm anymore. Nobody's ever going to work again. And there's probably some fear of that. And the same thought is now, right? We have artificial intelligence, we have robots, it's kind of scary. And so I'm going to hold off on the last part of answering that question, just to kind of walk through, part of the declining productivity was when you go from agriculture, before we really had equipment, you just needed, I think back in the Middle Ages, you needed basically a farmer per acre. That was the equation. And then obviously now you could have a farmer for 5,000 acres, right? So you had that machinery, but generally farming is a lower productivity product. Industry's really, really high, right? Because ultimately right now, most factories are very automated. And if you think about the math, right, if you go again from that Henry Ford assembly line, where you had lots and lots of people involved, as you took people off, productivity blew through the roof because you just had automation and the cogs came out. You had the same amount of cogs, but you had less people. When you go to services, using Jessica's practice again as an example, right? Jessica cannot create robot Jessica to take over her, or at least I don't think it'll go well. So I don't think it's a good idea, Jessica. But she can't create, so she can't do like, hey, I'll do the first 10 minutes in person and then I'll have AI take over. So a lot of services, there's just a limit of what you can do from a productivity standpoint in terms of kind of juicing those numbers. So kind of going full circle to the last part of the question of like, where can we go from a labor force? I'm not as concerned as others in terms of all of a sudden nobody's going to work. Drone operators, that was not a real thing a decade ago. I think there's a lot of jobs for drone operators. You're just going to have more and more items like that. And by the way, wealth creation itself has created jobs, right? You probably have way more tour guides than you've ever had. You have way more cruises than you've ever had. So there's going to be all these. And recently, what I heard of a job, I think it was called like photo declutterer or something. So now there's a job, you know, I take pictures all the time. There's complaints in my household that I take more pictures of food than I do of my kids. Whatever the case is, I have a lot of pictures on my phone. And then you come up to a life event where you want to, you know, put up some pictures to show everybody life events, or you want to put up a picture on a wall, you actually hire someone to go through your pictures and select the best ones. So that's a new favorite of mine. The point is, new jobs will occur. So the last item I do want to touch on before we turn it over and start having a conversation with Jessica is, why has productivity declined? Part of it, right, obviously, you know, part of it is explained by the shift in jobs, right? So you go from industry to an increasing service environment, especially here in the US, right? Part of it is globalization, which we've spoken about prior. You know, part of it is just the way the world's going. According to the real experts out there, only part of it could be attributed to that shift from industry to service. And there's really three thoughts out there. Thought number one, which is a classic, is the JCurve, right? And so what the JCurve is that you introduce amazing innovation, right? And one of the best examples for us all, the personal computer, amazing innovation. And for a period of time there, we didn't actually see growth. We didn't see productivity. And part of it is simply digesting it. We can't digest this new technology fast enough. So part of the answer is patience. Let's just be patient, and productivity, that J-curve is going to happen where all of a sudden productivity is going to pop. The second part may be that the world's becoming more and more complex, and it may just simply be harder to measure. We used COGS as an example, and it's really easy to equate COGS to a new car coming off the assembly line, or a new product, a new desk, whatever. Some COGS nowadays are digital assets, right? And so if there's an advertisement on Google or there's an advertisement on Facebook, how is that measured, right? Someone's not paying for it directly, they're paying for it indirectly, and there's a lot of middle people, and it gets really complicated. So there's an impression out there that this may actually be undercounted, and it sounds reasonable to me. And then the third one is that the recent innovations are partially personal, right? So when you look at social media, when you look at new ways of communicating, there's some level of personal element to the innovation. And so maybe we're benefiting from it, but we're not benefiting from it from an economic standpoint. We're benefiting from it in a personal standpoint. And one item that I think is really interesting from all this, and I want to get, this is a nice way to kind of pivot toward, to a conversation with Jessica, or some of these innovations, at least maybe now, maybe as we learn how to deal with it, could some of these not only be personal, maybe even be reasons for declining productivity? And what I mean by that, Jessica, is social media, right? So social media, right? It can be this amazing thing to keep in touch and to follow and all these things, but at the same time, it creeps, into our life, right? And then, you also have a million different ways to communicate. So if I want to go, find a friend, I could call them, I could text them, I could tag them, I could do all these things, right? So it gets really complicated. So I think we want to go down that rabbit hole with you, Jessica, in terms of that, in terms of whether whether there's a decline in productivity from all this attention going on, and then kind of how to combat it on a really general high level. But I'm going to start with one initial question for you, Jessica, and then we'll go from there, which is, I keep on hearing this term, work-life integration. Is this replacing the work-life balance paradigm? Like, what does that term mean? How should we think about it?
Sure. So work-life balance, think of it as the goal. Now, the truth is it's a goal that is actually unattainable. I don't think anyone, certainly no one on this webinar would say, yes, I have achieved perfect work-life balance. But one way to get closer to that goal that a lot of people have been talking about lately, as you mentioned, is work-life integration. And it's this idea that we no longer have to say, I work from, let's say, 9 to 6. I'm just producing cogs, as you mentioned, from that time. And then at 6 o'clock, I become a mom, I become a wife, I become a friend, and there's that really clear delineation. Instead, work-life integration gives you the opportunity to really weave in different aspects of your life. And certainly this past year, since March 2020, a lot of us having moved into our own homes, and I know, Joe, you're in your house or your apartment, and I'm in mine. I've been doing therapy from my apartment since March 2020. It gives us this opportunity to say, I can do a lot of different things, not necessarily all at once, and multitasking is certainly not the goal, but I can be a little bit more creative with my time. So for example, Joe, maybe, I don't know, maybe you woke up really early this morning and you did a little bit more research for this webinar, and then you walked your daughter to school, and then you came home and you did more work, and perhaps you got even an exercise in, a Peloton, a run in the park, whatever it is. And it's this idea that I can sort of stack different things on top of each other if it works. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, and certainly people on the call are wondering as well, isn't this going to mean that I could potentially work all of the time? And the answer is yeah. Unfortunately, what this work-life integration, even though it sounds so idealistic, what we've seen really happen is that people feel like, well, if there's no delineation, if work is home and home is work, I could keep going forever. And so the key to having a successful work-life integration is at some point really logging off. For some people, that's when I start cooking dinner, or when we order in dinner, it goes away. Maybe for some people they do a little bit afterwards, but at some point you have to stop working, or else we know the consequences. And I'm sure we'll talk about burnout. You can't talk about productivity without talking about burnout. But yes, so there's this opportunity with work-life integration to do a lot, to get a lot done, and to be creative and flexible about it. But there has to be a limit to it.
No, that's great. And while you're speaking, I was, there's these amazing benefits. Like at some point, I know a couple weeks ago, I was sitting there and I just couldn't get something that I really needed done. It was a little bit creative. And I was like, you know what, I'm lucky enough. I live a block from Central Park. It was a beautiful day, 3:30, I'm going for a jog. And I came back and I did a great job, by the way. I think I did a great job. I'm always biased. I think I did a great job. And I couldn't do that if I was in the office. I mean, conceptually, I guess I could have bought clothing there. You could always be ready, but I couldn't do that. So that's the benefits. But the other part.
And Joe, can I just interrupt you for a second? I don't know if you knew this when you decided to go for that run, but there is really good research out there coming from Stanford that shows that going for a walk or going for a run, it's not a coincidence that you felt like you were able to have that creative process afterwards. There was a lot, they did research where they had people, two groups, they had the same task. They had to think about an innovative use of household items. It doesn't matter what the task was. The people that did that seated came up with half as many ideas as the people that did that while walking on a treadmill. It wasn't a beautiful Central Park. It has nothing to do with that. It's just the process of walking. So you did a great job with that. Keep it up.
I got a double out of that, and I didn't even try. So that's
great.
Pretty.
There you go.
So the other side of that equation that you also touched on was turning off. And I think everybody knows, they know instinctively that they need to turn off, but I think people have They have different experiences on working on that, on dealing with that. Could you, are there tips you can provide? I think you mentioned at some point, maybe you turned off your phone, at least for dinner. I don't know. Could you provide some tips and some thoughts on how to turn off,
Sure.
how to set those lines?
Sure. And of course, it's always a work in progress, and none of this is going to be perfect, but it's really about being intentional. If I want to check my email, if I want to check social media, I have to think this is something that I would like to do now that's going to make me feel good, or that's going to allow me to connect with others. Or perhaps you mentioned social media, so I'll go down that rabbit hole, the very scary rabbit hole of social media. Social media is great in many ways, even from a business perspective. I believe you posted this webinar on LinkedIn. Perhaps we have a few more cogs in the wheel because of that. And so that I think, according to your definition of productivity, that was a good use of social media. Now, of course, we all know the negative effects of social media and how it really is. It's a time suck and it's a productivity suck. And so it really is about being intentional and setting limits for yourself. And that might mean really putting a timer on it, saying, hey, for the next 10 minutes, I want to check in, see what's going on in the world, whether it's professionally or personally, but I'm going to really set that limit. Other things, I just recently heard about this, that you can turn your phone onto grayscale. I'm not sure, I'm not a good phone or tech person, but you can Google how to put your phone on grayscale. And what it does is it turns your phone into just black or white. And that can have a profound effect on how likely you are to just keep picking up that phone. Because every time you pick up that phone, it's that bright, shiny piece of candy or shiny toy. And putting it in grayscale makes it a little bit make you a little bit less likely to engage in that way. There's also apps you can use where it turns off your phone. I know my phone essentially shuts off from 9 till 7. So don't try to call me between 9 and 7, because that's my time to be with my family, to disconnect. Now, is it always that exactly like that? No, sometimes I have to get in a few emails, from 9 to 10, and I'll do that. But it's really, again, about being intentional.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And, we've spoken a bit. I put it on a couple of the monthly market commentaries, and I think there was one exploration where we spoke about how powerful social media is. The Social Dilemma is a very scary show on Netflix, I guess, a documentary. These programs use AI. They know us better than we know ourselves, and so once you go on, it's sometimes hard to get yourself off. So it's a fair warning. So those are great tips. I myself, I turn off my phone at 10. It's from 10 to 7 every day. It automatically turns off. So I don't think it's supposed to allow anybody to get through beyond family, and it shuts down. And it's at some point I did it during COVID, and it really is helpful. So that's one element of it in terms of how to turn yourself off. The other element, which I'm curious as to some thoughts on, is that even within work, right? Mm-hmm. When I'm at work, I get it from all levels, right? So I have emails, we use Teams, we used to use Slack. People can text me, they could call me, which happens less and less frequently because of all these other devices.
Right. What's a phone?
Exactly. What's that? We have this program called Quip where you could tag people. And so there's a million ways to catch my attention.
Yeah, and they got you.
They got me. So, and it becomes really easy in that, from just looking at things all the time to see, okay, what's happening, because you're getting emails constantly. What are some tips and some thoughts on dealing with all of that?
Yeah, it's difficult, and some of it is unavoidable. If your team uses Slack, for example, and the expectation is that your Slack will always be on, perhaps that's unavoidable. But something like email, a lot of people use this technique called email batching, which is that I'm not going to check my email all of the time as it comes in. Instead, I'm going to, again, be intentional. I'm going to keep using that word and have set times when I check. So maybe I'm going to check at 9 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 6 at night. And those are the times, and the other times I can actually shut off my email. If that would work for you, if you have that self-discipline as well. But it's a great way to just, again, be intentional. Meetings, we can even batch. There's a lot of research that shows that when you have a meeting coming up, about the 20 minutes prior to it, you're not doing work. You're thinking about that meeting. I'll be honest, 20 minutes, maybe half hour before we got on this webinar, I really wasn't doing much work. So if you're constantly having meetings sort of staggered throughout the day, and then you get pulled into that meeting prep time, it really interferes with that workflow. And that's what we're looking for, is that flow. And so instead, some organizational psychologists, they recommend this meeting batching. So perhaps, Monday morning is when I have all of these meetings. Monday afternoon, I can do this other creative work or analytical work, and again, being intentional and having things at certain times. A lot of times it's not about time management necessarily. It's much more about timing management. So really thinking along those terms.
Right. Yeah. And I hear, I'm pretty sure I'll be at least partially working from home forever. And I think a lot of people, there's this new reality. Some people are going to, not be allowed even to come in just based on how things are set up, which I think is really interesting. And then there's going to be some mix, and it's going to be really interesting where this world goes from that standpoint. One item I've been hearing about, and I personally don't have this issue, but I've heard of Zoom angst, right? Of, oh my God, I need to show up on video. How do I deal? So what are your thoughts? You gave us kind of I think it's a really good tip in terms of, batching meetings together so that you're being efficient. And, what's the thoughts in terms of Zoom, whether Zoom's overused, the realities of Zoom?
Yeah, I think a year ago, we all kind of got, we were all freaking out, but then we kind of got excited that we don't necessarily have to be in the same room. We can use Zoom, and we started overusing it. And as a result, do you remember, I'm sure, Joe, you had one happy hour, at least one a day. We were doing these Zoom happy hours, and it was great. And then it dropped, and people said, I'm sick of this. If you're the one deciding on the medium of the meeting or the interaction, really think about what is your goal, and then what's the best medium for it. So if it's a new client, let's say, I would try to get on Zoom. I would try to see their face, have them see your face, encourage them to get on Zoom or whatever platform it is that you're using, Microsoft Teams. I certainly don't, I'm not advertising one over the other.
Disclaimer, right? We don't
exactly.
Talk in. Yeah.
Exactly. So, certainly, or if it's about team building, you want to see people's faces. If it's more analytical, if there's slides you need to show people, if there's a lot of data, a lot of numbers, perhaps an email makes more sense. If it's a quick question, it could be a Slack. So again, thinking about what's the appropriate medium for what I'm trying to do. Another thing with Zoom, people don't love Zoom because you have to see yourself all of the time. And we're not used to that. In the real world, when I'm talking to someone, I'm just looking at them. I'm not looking at me. And so one thing that some people do is there's a setting on Zoom where you could actually not see your own face. Everyone else sees you. So you're still doing what you need to do in terms of building that connection, building that empathy, but you yourself don't need to be staring at a mirror. So for those on the webinar right now who really struggle with that, check that out, see how to do that. Use technology to your advantage. In other words.
I did not know about it.
Yeah.
So maybe the last topic or last thought on this topic, sometimes it's nice to really put everything in I guess thinking about it from a extreme standpoint. We had a little area in our explorations report titled "Working Hard, Hardly Working." And it really came off a really good Wall Street Journal article, which gave a long history of work, like how much people worked, right? And so there used to be, you could really think of it as a 7-day work week, and then it became a 6-day work week. And actually here in the US at some point in the, I want to say 1920s, maybe 1930s, it became a 5-day, I think it was earlier, whatever. It became a 5-day work week. Read the explorations to find out all the details. But it became a 5-day work week. And over the last 100 years, our work weeks actually declined on average. It's gone from 50 hours to 40 hours. Mm-hmm. So all that seems amazing, yet it doesn't feel that way, right? And so the example where I want to go with this is vacation. I'm imagining, or at least I think earlier in my career, because I didn't always have a phone or email or anything. So you could say the late 90s, if I went on vacation, that was it. I was on vacation. I took a week off. I literally did not speak, hear, know anything. The world could have been blowing up. I could have come back and they'd be like, yeah, the company doesn't exist anymore. I'd be like, oh, wow, I really didn't know that. Now, if someone sneezes, someone might say, bless you over email, and I will see that, 3,000 miles away. So it's kind of like a nice, I thought it might be interesting to see or hear what you think or how to disconnect on vacation, because people could kind of take it down from there to some of the earlier tips you mentioned, even on a day-to-day basis. But it's a nice way to think about, how do I truly disconnect, right? Yeah. On vacation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like now when people are booking their hotels or their Airbnbs, the first thing they're looking at is, does it have good Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
Can I do my job? And that's not the point of a vacation, of course. The point is to disconnect. And I think one thing that might be helpful is if you're going on this vacation with your partner or with a friend, to kind of have a little bit of accountability with each other, to say, hey, we need this, and let's try to really disconnect as much as possible. Certainly creating some activities in your vacation is going to help with that. And there was something else that I wanted to say about vacations. It'll come to me, but yeah, you have to. Oh, I know what I was going to say is that when we talk about burnout and when we talk about disconnecting, a lot of times people think, okay, yeah, that's in 5 weeks, I'm going on vacation, I'm going to completely disconnect. But right now I just gotta. That's not what it is. You have to think about self-care on a daily basis. You can't wait for that massage appointment 3 weeks from now, or that vacation 5 weeks from now. It really has to start today, or else we really do see, I know, Joe, you and I have talked a lot about this, about burnout, and it's a real thing. It's really scary. I don't know if maybe we could talk a little more about that right now.
Let's go right into it. It's right on. It was kind of the last major topic I had, which is, maybe it would help to really define what is burnout. Yeah. And then how do you know if you're burnt out, right? Because I think people could easily be burnt out and not even recognize it, not even realize it. So maybe defining it, and then we could speak about, how you know if you're being affected by it.
Yeah. So I don't have to define it, because luckily in 2019, the World Health Organization finally defined it in their international classification of diseases. And they defined it as a syndrome that's resulting from chronic workplace stress that is being unsuccessfightly managed. And in many ways, that was huge. To recognize it as a true syndrome, that destigmatized it. And B, recognizing that it's not necessarily an individual issue. It really is a systemic issue. When we say that it's not being successfully managed, it's the management is not successfully managing it. So you ask, how do you know that you're burnt out? I like to think of it as you're apathetic, you just don't care, or you're sort of cynical about your job, and you've lack of empathy. When you no longer truly care about other people that are involved with it, that's a signal to you that you're probably at least inching towards burnout. Other symptoms, difficulty concentrating, it might actually go into feelings of depression. You're disillusioned with your job. There could be sleep disturbances and even physical symptoms. So it's a real issue. And I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, if that's okay, because I'm imagining that and you yourself and myself, I have a staff now, that people that have teams that have people reporting to them have to recognize that this is a huge issue, and have to not only allow people to take care of themselves, and we can talk about what that is, but in some ways enforce it. I've heard of a lot of companies, a lot of startups and companies that are maybe a little bit more in the know about these things. They're giving mandatory mental health days. And that's huge, because that's an acknowledgement that in order for our team to be productive and to produce good creative work, we need to let them reset. It's almost like if you were to bring in your car to the shop and you're like, it doesn't work. It's just not working. I don't know what's going on. And they're like, did you put gas in it? That's what self-care is. You can't expect yourself or your team to be productive if you don't take care. And so what does take care mean? We talked about the we'll call it the digital detox, getting away from screens. And that means even like during your lunch period. I'm thinking about my kid. He had lunch about an hour ago.
12:20 to 12:47 is my, so that's when I
exactly. Period. When they're home, and when they're at school, they can do what they're thinking. But your lunch time, I know I'm guilty of this sometimes, but I'm really trying to be mindful of it. Don't take your lunch and then just keep doing work or even checking out social media or the news. Disconnect. Look outside the window. If your partner is at home, talk to your partner. Just chill out a little bit. So that digital detox is huge. Walking is huge. Exercise. And also just really being able to talk about how things are going in the workplace. So, those of you that manage teams, check in once in a while. I know it's this new buzzword, but a lot of people are talking about psychological safety at work. And it's this notion that I can freely say to my manager, to my supervisor, to my boss, hey, I'm having a hard time here, and for them to empathize with that.
Okay, that's great. I think those are some great tips, both on a personal level and on a management level of how to deal with it. I think that there's one question, and there's a few items on the queue in questions, and I think we'll end with one question there. I think it's a really nice end to it. Or actually, another one just popped up, so there's two. And I just want to address two comments. So one, because they're comments, not questions, but it works. All wealth is the result of increasing efficiency of capital structure. Yeah, I fully agree, right? That there's some element of productivity that's connected to that. And there's an element that we didn't even get into today of lessening, less capital results in less productivity. So it's an interesting thought. And then kudos to you, Jessica, because at some point someone said, here's another reason not to look at Facebook. So you got another person getting there.
I think Mark Zuckerberg is going to be knocking on my door later, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. What's wrong with you? So here's a question for you.
Sure.
I'm actually going to put both of them in at the same time, and we could kind of end with it, because I think they're both good ends for this webinar. One, can you provide tips for work-life balance as applies to families with kids, right? So you kind of talked about, I think you touched on it a little bit, but like, you're adding so much, especially when now you're in your house itself and there's all this commotion going on. And then the second one, the follow-up is any resources or people we can follow in media on these topics. So just the topics of burnout and how to deal with this work-life integration.
Yeah. So families at home and all that. And, it certainly depends on where you are. I think there are some states where the kids are still full-time at home and some where they're in person completely. I know we're dealing with a hybrid model. First thing is about flexibility and just recognizing you're not going to be perfect at this, and your child is not going to be perfect at this. And certainly, back in March and April, a lot of my friends and I, we were talking about how we were really utilizing, let's be honest, the Xbox, because that's what our kids were drawn to. And it worked a little bit because it allowed us a little bit of breathing room. And of course, then we had to rein that in a little bit. But so my point is being flexible with yourself and with your children, and also modeling for them that we have time where we're working and then we have time where we get to play. Connections with your family, surprisingly, are going to make you work better. Connections with friends. I went out with a group of friends last night, and we all texted this morning how great it was. And one said, girls, you don't know how important this was for me, and how this really, I forgot the word she used, but it revitalized me or something along those lines.
Vigorous.
And I can
Yeah.
imagine today she's a lot more productive at work. So these things are real. This is not just, oh, that sounds nice, self-care. Connecting with other people, it's really, really going to help. You wanted to know about resources. I mean, these are just my resources, but I love Harvard Business Review. I think it's some great thought leadership. You can subscribe to their newsletter, so that's great. You mentioned, Joe, I am passionate about women in leadership and women in the workplace. So I listen to Women at Work, which is also put out by HBR. It's a podcast about some of these issues. So they certainly talk about burnout. They talk about the work-life balance. They talk about how the truth is the pandemic has had more negative effects on women. A lot of women had to leave the workforce. I think maybe that was in some of your graphs.
Yeah. Participation rate. Yeah. So unemployment is it's really a 4-week running of who's actually applying for jobs.
Yeah.
And if you leave, you just come out of the participation rate. So, that's where you see some of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's been disproportionately more women because they were taking on a lot of the childcare and healthcare roles. So anyway, HBR is a great one. In terms of burnout, Jennifer Moss does a lot of great research. She has a book as well. In terms of productivity, I love reading Adam Grant, Daniel Pink. They have some great stuff that they talk about. Again, I think I'd mentioned about it, that it's not really time management, it's about timing management. So both of them talk about how to use timing to your advantage. So those are a few things that it certainly inform my work week and what I talk about with both patients and also in webinars like this.
Excellent. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today. That was all so interesting, and it really, touched on the topic and hopefully, definitely helped us. I put your information here for everybody on the webinar. Thank you, everybody on the webinar, for attending. Go ahead, Jessica.
No, I was just saying great, and feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, no worries. So thank you once again. Thanks for being our guest, and thank you everybody for attending. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.